Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
You know what this is today?
I do. It's Fascism Friday.
Yes, and it's episode 229, which is not a round number.
No.
The Subverting Systems of Subjugation, the second in the series. Seriously.
That's a lot of S's.
Yeah.
And I've got my angry and ineffective t-shirt on.
I'm not even that effective.
So I'm feeling good.
Here's what I have, though. I'll tell a story. So back before the pandemic, we had a certificate program in prophetic spirituality that we shelved because a lot of it was wilderness based, and we didn't want to do it. And one of the participants in that, like, we gathered a stone during one of our practices.
Nice.
And the students gathered our stones and made us necklaces.
Cool.
So this is very cool, very special.
Yeah.
And this little stone is the heart of anger and ineffectiveness. It's a talisman of power.
The talisman of angry and ineffective.
CK says, good morning, anti-fascist. And also good morning to you, anti-fascist.
Good morning to you.
James, who actually lived in Hawaii for quite a time, says aloha. So I think that's more legit than if I said it.
I was wondering if he had gone to Hawaii.
No, he lived there for some of his upbringing.
Oh, okay, cool.
And then my favorite angry and ineffective day.
Yes.
Speaking of which, and I saw this article, and I'm wondering if anybody saw this, and I'm going to check it out after. It's from Jacobin. It's kind of the socialist magazine, one of the bigger ones, about the strategy of being intentionally stupid. and the idea is that, like, maybe being intentionally angry and effective as a way of slowing the ears is a thing. And so that's all I got from the subtitle. And I'm like, well, that's a form of monkey wrenching. But I mean, that's the spirituality of angry ineffectiveness that I'm here for.
Sort of. I don't know, right now during the pandemic, we have a lot of people being intentionally stupid. I'm not really seeing it as a positive thing.
Well, I mean, intentionally stupid, and it's like, hey, can you fill out these Form 302s for our blah, 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 blah. What?
Like, no. What's a form?
What's a form? Where's my name go? Like, that's cool. But like,
okay, yeah, that's cool.
Horse medicine. That sounds splendid. I don't like that.
Yeah. So actually, Kathleen, I just read an article this morning about a town in Missouri, and this was a town that had been featured in a little video article early on in the pandemic. And at that point, it was like, we're not going to wear masks. Fuck it. This is so dumb. We're just something will kill us. We'll just die, whatever. And so they went back to the town, which is now this like COVID wasteland. Like it's just the number of people that are dying, that are sick. And people are still just like, no, I'm not going to get the vaccine. It might be dangerous. Like, what, compared to your dead mother or friend, the vaccine might be dangerous. So it is real. It's real.
Progression is real. Again, that ties into a few weeks ago, the myth of progress. Things can move backwards. I mean, it's technically progressing because there's movement, but movement isn't always a positive thing.
Yeah.
Alan says, good morning.
Morning, Alan.
And I like how there's a picture of a little flower. We also have a picture of a little flower as our kind of background for the episode.
Very nice. So subversion. One of the things that we were talking about after the episode on Wednesday that we thought we'd bring up today, and it kind of ties to the angry and ineffective thing, right? So that this effectiveness addiction that that industrialization gets us into, right? And everybody wants to be more and more effective, and what of course we don't think about is effective towards what, effective for whom. The other thing that we don't think about, though, and this is what I wanted to talk about a little bit, is that the effectiveness addiction thing assumes a very observable linear time cause and effect kind of relationship with what we do. And the thing about subversion and the thing about spiritual practice and spiritual community is that our actions are not necessarily linear and observable.
No.
And we tell stories about this all the time, and we have, the seed sowing metaphor and things. But to me, these are the kinds of spiritual things that we say, but we don't actually really believe or live out. So we'll say those things, and then we'll go to work and meet with the effectiveness guru who's going to tell us about how to, get more effective and better. And one of the things that I was thinking about with effectiveness and subversion, when you were talking about the getting stupid thing, is that, people have been posting comments about this recently in a lot of these discussions about our economic situation, is that American workers and workers all over the world, but American workers have actually become amazingly more effective, right? Productivity has gone way, way up.
And
have wages gone up
in the economy?
There's a lot more money. Have wages gone up? No. Right? Have workers benefited from their increased effectiveness? No. Right? Somebody's calculated that the minimum wage, if you tied it to the increases in productivity, should actually be about $26 an hour right now. Right? And so subverting things by engaging in this kind of non-linear activity, which is really for the good of humanity, may seem really ineffective, but in the long run, it might actually be way more effective.
My brain is abuzz with all sorts of things, and I'm also aware that I have students in the class listening, and I don't want to give all my goods up because I'm talking, I'm teaching a class on social systems, spirituality. So
go ahead. Repetition is good.
No, but there's lots of things going on in my head. One of them is the robot thing. So this shows how baked in we are in our thinking. Yeah. We just need to acknowledge this. So
are we talking about robot birds now, or
no? I'm talking about the non-conspiratorial birds or robots.
Oh.
So algorithms, computers, smarter systems, point of sale, all that leading towards robots that do mechanized, productive things, even to the point of McDonald's now having basically becoming big vending machines. Right. All this is part of a trend that increases productivity, increases profits, and so increases wealth. And then all of a sudden it's people lose jobs. And so there's already a pre-programmed way of thinking that we have in our society because it's baked in, that I don't have a job, therefore the best I can hope for is really crappy welfare. And that all seems normal to us, if that, and that's always under attack. The idea of Social Security existing by the time I retire, which isn't that 20 years from now. It's not that far away.
That's going to be gone.
Because we have these assumptions that most people can't even challenge. And so the question then becomes what choices do you meaningfully have? And this is where it gets fascinating, because the dominant mode of understanding what society is still kind of what's considered the classic European model, that society is the sum total of human choices and interactions, which is false. So one of the people I've been reading, Nicholas Luhmann, actually one of his great statements is that there are no human beings in society. And what he means is These systems have their own internal communication and logic in events. Mm-hmm. And individuals in them, individuals don't communicate. Communication communicates. You don't know. If I like we're talking right now, you don't exactly know what I'm thinking and feeling. All we have is these modes of communication between us, and those are determined by the system that we inhabit. And in a complex society, we have medical systems and legal systems that have their own terminology, and those two systems struggle to figure out how to interact. We see this all the time. Mm-hmm. So, as an individual in a system, if I'm still working under this assumption that my intentions, which is, let's start talking Christian language. Intentions somehow are determinative, like the way we think about things, but that's not true.
Yeah. In fact, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Well, and at any given time, no one has one intention. They have multiple intentions. And then our actions are often unintentional because we're projecting and all that kind of stuff. We talked about that plenty of times.
Yeah.
Right? And then when we do act within Christian stuff, we don't think in terms of effectiveness. We think in terms of faithfulness, usually. And that's a witness model that somehow you act in a way and people will then say, that looks good. I'm going to make an intentional choice to do that too. Mm-hmm. That also doesn't quite work. And so we have our own internal church logic as a system that works within, that doesn't work outside of itself. Mm-hmm. What do you do with all that?
Yeah.
And so this is where disruption and being angry and effective is, we joke about it, but there's some truth to that. We're talking about how do we become willfully maladaptive? Because we can talk about burning of the third precinct as ineffective, but you know what? That is one of the cheapest things you can do is burn a building. The uprising was incredibly inexpensive in terms of the actors involved. Mm-hmm. There was no fundraising for an uprising. There was hardly any planning. It happened, and it really did disrupt. And there was an effectiveness to it that we have failed to seize upon.
Yeah,
but you were going to say stuff in there.
Well, and I think what's interesting to me in terms of connecting this to fascism, what you're talking about, is that I think that the individuals. Yeah, and the guy that you mentioned and his idea of there are no individuals in society. I mean, there are a lot of folks in psychology systems theory that will say the same thing, that the idea of the psychological individual is a mythology. That really they're just psychological systems, and there are people playing roles in those systems, and and of course, Americans get totally freaked out by this kind of thought because, the highest good in America is the individual. And so it's like, what do you mean there's no individuals? Burn them at the stake or something. But I think one of the things that starts to happen, right, is that the individuals begin to chafe at and feel a sort of frustration at the fact that the systems either sort of aren't working or breaking down or whatever. And that's one of the things that then propels towards fascism, right? Because, and I know that I mentioned this a few weeks ago, right, that one of the things about fascism that, bizarrely enough, even people who would say they hate fascism praise, right, is this kind of myth that fascism is super effective. Right. And so as people desire that effectiveness and that view that, my actions matter and go to something directly. And it's like, well, fine, let's just have, and this is Christian fundamentalism too. Let's just have one set of right answers and one set of activities. And so I know if I do X, Y, or Z, Jesus is going to like me. I'm going to go to heaven. Right. And one of the interesting things, a lot of people that I work with who are coming out of the fundamentalist world, that notion that there's always a right answer and there's always a simple binary and there's always something that I just have to figure out and I'm going to get it and I'm going to know that is an incredibly powerful state of formation. Mm-hmm. And so this idea that that some sort of direct action effectiveness is the highest order good, and that if we're not seeing that, And if some dominant group is feeling threatened that that's not happening, we have to force everybody into that. That's a very powerful negative force, right? And so, this notion of subverting is in part also about being able to hang out with indeterminacy, right? To be able to be comfortable with not knowing, to be able to be comfortable with groundlessness. Right? And those are things that just drive people nuts. They want to know, like, what do I do? And what are the results? And, let's get going. Right?
Yep. Got some comments rolling in. Keep them coming, folks. So Kathleen says, in Missouri, we have mastered the idea of not giving a fuck for anything except personal choice, unless you're talking about women's bodies.
Yep. Yeah, there are a number of states that are mastering that particular conundrum.
Yeah, and that's a whole
other thing.
CK writes, so what about subverting the truth? It's apparent that this campaign is very effective. Well, this gets to another thing, like another one of these foolish notions that conservatives, really believe, and most conservative talk show hosts really believe this, that conservatives are the rational ones, and that really this idea that our society is a sum total of choices assumes that we're rational actors, and that we make choices based upon weighing evidence and acting accordingly, when we all know most people make choices based on instinct and emotions and feeling things, and then they come up with the rationale after. Like, this happens a lot. And so subverting the truth is very easy if you can appeal to these gnawing kind of feelings that people have. If you're good at measuring the landscape of, like, well, these people are freaked out and they're angry, they need somebody to blame. That's why scapegoating is so useful in politics, and it happens all the time. Because it gets right at that.
Yeah. Well, what's great to me, CK, about this question is that, you're bringing up a sort of countervailing meaning or direction for the idea of subversion, right? So what you're pointing out is that subversion can be used for very unhelpful means. Which isn't what we've been focusing on so much, but right. I mean, that it's very possible to increase blindness, essentially, to increase lack of awareness. And that's a almost sort of demonic form of subversion. That in some ways is a lot easier, as Ash, you're saying. It's because you can do that by appealing to this sort of mass emotionality or hysteria or psychosis that can develop, that we're seeing, right now all over the place.
When it shows, like, again, going back to this notion that there are no people in society, there are only communication. People don't communicate, communication communicates is another one of these Nicholas Luhmann things. Well, and so then we have to figure out how do we disrupt communication? And so this is a great example of, the elections and the Democrats. Democrats, the diehards, did not like Bernie Sanders for a number of reasons. And one of them, I really believe, is an instinctive distrust of how he appealed to emotions. Right? Because he was coming up with an alternative narrative that connected, like, with my very, very conservative family, who were like, well, he's willing to name corporate bastards. I don't know, I got East Coast a little bit there, as I do with my sloppy accents. Well, this is the thing, we have understanding what's driving someone emotionally, and that there's a logic underneath it. Like we talked about, a couple months ago about the wisdom of anger. There's a reason people are upset. We have to give them good stories about why they're upset, instead of saying, well, let me condescendingly tell you why you're wrong with facts. That doesn't really do anything.
No.
Wilderness wandering as way of life. I don't know what that's a referral to, except for that just sounds great right now.
Yeah.
I haven't been in the woods for a while.
Right. Yeah, wilderness wandering is a way of life. Yeah, and I think that in many ways that is how the spiritual life is often sort of described or framed. Um, and that appears very ineffective.
No, and I mean, there's a reason the prophetic tradition is a wilderness tradition. When it's relying on God and a different set of relationships that are not societally based the way that we think of society in terms of organizations and institutions. And then it's no mistake that Jesus spending time in the company of the angels, the beasts, and Satan comes back into society with the message of repent, the reign of God is at hand. This sort of this countering of all the alienating abstractions of society that you really get in touch with as you allow yourself to be precarious and rely upon the presence of God for your sustenance.
And as you allow yourself to be kind of emptied of all or most things.
Yeah, and doesn't mean that you go camping all of a sudden you're going to be enlightened and be able to speak truth, but there's something about the wilderness tradition. Sari says hi. I'm going to jump to her comment and go back. We are interbeing and intra-being, a whole person made up of multiple legacies and ancestries. The American idea of the individual is trash. Yes, it's a subversion of the truth.
And intra-being. That's cool. Beautiful. I love that.
Ellen says, does trickle-down economics reference the rich pissing on the poor? I think so.
That's actually a more accurate description of what happens with trickle-down economics. Yeah.
CK says, Western progress is working against us as a society, and with the integration of artificial intelligence, it's only going to increase the wealth gap and create a greater caste system, in my opinion. Yes, and this is terrifying because
absolutely.
Even the idea of universal basic income, UBI, which I think could be very helpful, is a necessity for people to survive. And so a lot of even these billionaires say this, but then the part of the challenge is work unions aren't that powerful these days, but at least unions have levers they can pull to monkey wrench the system. But once you have people who aren't even workers and they rely upon a system to give them sustenance, they become even more precarious. So it's terrifying.
Well, and you mentioned the issue with Social Security, and because of the pandemic, Social Security is now scheduled to run out 1 year even earlier. So 2035, and that's only 14 years from now, right? And so and it's interesting to me to kind of put together some of what has happened with the pandemic and a lot of the rhetoric around the pandemic with Social Security running out, right? Because the early approach of the GOP during the pandemic was, well, it's only old people that are dying of this, so who gives a fuck, right? And those are the people that are on Social Security. And so as Social Security starts to become insolvent, and by the way, it actually already is insolvent. We've borrowed all of the money that's supposed to be in the bank. There are a bunch of IOUs sitting in some vault somewhere. But when it becomes truly insolvent, then at that point, the pressure is going to be more and more to have folks, as they age, just become totally disposable, right? And so if a pandemic wipes out a few million of them, well, that's great because it's really good for the budget.
Shit. Helen says, I was taught by Ethan Hughes at the Possibility Alliance, subversion comes in a tri-Venn diagram of contemplation, survival / subsistence, and direct action. You have to kind of think about that for a while, but I mean, I like those things.
Yeah, so that's a good thing.
I mean, I think those are components of it. And here, in the sense, contemplation is kind of a posture by which you can start giving attention to things and seeing truth rather than presuming a bunch of myths is true.
Yeah.
Kind of
yeah. And one of the things that contemplation does, and, this is one of the things we're working on in the class that I'm teaching about, is that it forces us to pause and look at things far more carefully. Right? And so this idea of communication just happening, communicating with itself, right? This is the flow of habitual pattern, both within and between people. I mean, we could say the same thing is happening inside each one of us, right? I mean, if you start to pay attention to your own mind, you realize that there's just a bunch of communication running around that you're really not in charge of, right? I mean, it's just happening. And, it's been put there by your parents, by society. Like, there are all these things that you think and feel about yourself, and you're like, holy fuck, like, where'd that come from? Right? And this stuff is just going on all the time. And what what contemplation forces you to do is to actually train your awareness to slow down and to simply watch this flow, right? Not continually react to it. And that in and of itself is subverting it, because now you're not putting your endless kind of energy around just jumping in and jumping on whatever bandwagon is coming your way. And so, yeah, that's a huge part of the subversion process.
Series writes, American culture never gave a shit about bodily autonomy and actual personal freedom unless it means free to be a tyrant. I hate the double-speaking imperial propaganda. I mean, that's totally true. Like, this is libertarians, even, if we want to talk about the most freedom-minded among kind of the conservative wing of American politics, right, is still incredibly authoritarian. It's still based upon this idea of ownership and that there's an owner class. And so, yeah, there's all this sort of doublespeak, and to the point that I really honestly don't really think that most libertarians are in on the joke. I don't think they realize that they're inconsistent.
No.
So this is why, like, trying to convince, if our goal is to convince people of a better way, it's not going to be coming, charts and graphs are not going to get at it. Because it's a deep spiritual formation issue, and it's an emotional, like, it's a narrative, emotional, deep thing that can't just be got at with facts and figures. We need to have a better way of storytelling and getting at the guts of stuff. Ellen writes, countervailing. Are you using the phrase in a specific way? I don't remember that term coming up. Did you use it?
Yeah, no, I used that when I was talking about CK's question, subverting the truth. So just countervailing, just going in the opposite direction.
Okay. Ellen writes, Transmission is a game show where two highly intelligent contestants relate beautiful, spontaneous comments to a weekly theme. What do we win?
Yeah, right. What do we win?
Besides
maybe liberation, friendship.
I mean, maybe liberation. That's like the possible winning. Like, there's game shows where you can win up to $250,000 and everyone goes home with $40,000.
Right.
So hopefully I want.
Maybe we just win little bits of liberation.
Little tiny
$20 worth of liberation.
Liber bits. Catherine says, humor, play, and cuteness can all be deeply subversive. They really can. I mean,
yes.
There's lots of tradition around that. I think these especially helpful in confronting big, scary problems that we tend to repress or deny. Also, just life-giving in general. Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely the thing. Finding life amidst death is essential. I mean, what's that great saying? Is that an Emma Goldman thing? If I can't dance, it's not my revolution.
No, I don't know. Yeah, I haven't heard that.
I think it's an Emma
But one of the things I think about, though, is how working folks tend to be much better at partying than upper class folks.
You mean walking around in a gown and taking drinks off of trays isn't like a great way of partying?
Well, it's very repressed.
Yeah, it is very clenched.
And I think that there's a reason for this, and I think, Catherine, that this is what you're getting at, right? That that humor, that play, that raucousness, that I mean, just having a fun time is really
parties.
Karaoke parties. Is really, really important when you're faced and confronted with these big scary problems, and also when you're confronted with an incredible level of powerlessness about it. Like, a friend of mine used to make the joke, the proletariat must party. I mean, I think that and I think about that in religious spaces. And, Ash, you were talking about how when you were designing the queering ritual, how many boring things you were getting from sort of staid mainliner Christian types. And, and we were talking about the turning, which was this awesome kind of liturgical activity that we were doing for a while. And Catherine, you did some just beautiful stuff with that. And, I mean that to celebrate in a really different kind of outrageous way is very, very subversive.
A few comments here, and we're at past time, so we're going to blaze.
Yeah. Blaze.
James writes, my wilderness wandering comment was related to Dan's comment about nonlinear, non-effective movement in the spiritual life.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Because
I figured
the rest of creation doesn't line up in rows.
No.
I mean, I don't think moose believe in the myth of progress. So,
no.
Kathleen writes, every year for 30 years, the conference wanted me to name 3 goals for my local church and to outline how I would meet those goals. No room for wandering or listening to the Spirit.
I know. It's hilarious in a really sad way.
Cheryl writes, do we know the 13 social miracles of Zachary Stein? Never heard that. Education in a time between worlds. Number 10 is mutual respect between all major world religions.
Okay, cool.
13 social miracles of Zachary Stein.
Okay, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. Know yourself is subversive.
Yeah.
And also knowing that there's a limit to how much we can know ourselves. Not assuming things about ourselves. That's why one of the big pieces of contemplative practice is curiosity about yourself and non-judgment.
No.
Which, I mean, there's things inside of ourselves that we don't like. And so that's where the whole idea of the shadow comes from. We push it into that sack. And knowing ourselves means like being curious and open and not judging ourselves, and playing with ourselves in multiple ways. Catherine writes, I also keep thinking about the subversive art that has made it past various direct and indirect censors. For example, in film history, through dancing on the lines, being too outrageous to be taken seriously, double meanings, a monster and magic metaphors, etc.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ellen is saying, yep, that's an Emma Goldman quote. If I can't dance, it's not my revolution. Yes, blue collar partiers unite. The Communist Party. There's a meme that I often send my son. The people that shows Marx and Lenin like dancing and says Communist Party. Pleasure is subversive.
Yes, absolutely.
That's it. I mean, gets really hard for some people because when I came out as genderqueer and started talking about fulfillment and things like that, people said, well, that's capitalism. That's individualism. Because in our society, even the left in the West tradition, like, doesn't understand how we can think about things like enjoyment, pleasure, even self-fulfillment outside of an individualistic mode, as though somehow capitalist societies don't have those things.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, the church is the worst offender in this. I mean, so many people are raised in a Christianity where it's like, if it doesn't hurt and feel bad, it's not Christian. So, and you see these like mean, grumpy people that have been, head ushers of the church for 50 years, and they just glare at you when you come in and make sure you're dressed properly. So, yeah.
Here we go, CK. The wealthy are too busy eating babies while the rest of us are dancing into Zion like in the Matrix. I'm looking forward to the new Matrix movie. I don't want to get my hopes up too much.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
James writes, but entertainment can be used to placate people as well. That's for sure. Party of proletariat or bread and circuses? This is a great question we should maybe talk about sometime, is like, what does pleasure and enjoyment and joy look like, and how is that different than entertainment? Recreation.
So entertainment is often can be the most boring party. Right, because it's maybe a mass-produced thing that is just sort of given to you, and it sort of zombifies you, right? But that's why I say the working class often have better parties, right? And you think about this from a music point of view, for example. I mean, you think about mountain music, you think about blues music, you think about rap, you think about all these musical traditions, you think about art, right? What is one thing that pisses off the oppressive class more than anything else? Tagging, right? I mean, I just cannot believe, I see these proper white people, that horrible graffiti. It's like, that is fucking awesome public art, right? So, I mean, oftentimes the working class is the purveyor of all kinds of awesome popular culture stuff. And of course, that can become co-opted and all that kind of thing. But they are often creators of their own entertainment because they can't afford societal, they can't afford to go to the symphony or to Broadway or whatever. And so they rock out and make their own music. And so that's a great distinction.
Yeah, and I could talk a lot about that, but I think maybe that weaving that into some sort of theme would be interesting.
Maybe partying should be the next week's topic.
Yeah,
just a thought.
Ellen writes, that Communist Party thing is actually true. Listen to the Behind the Bastards on Stalin's all-nighters. I wouldn't want to party with Stalin.
No.
I'm sorry.
No.
I'm sorry for all you tankies that are listening. Tyler writes, how do people wake up, work 40 hours a week, 9+ hours a day, and think, yes, this is the way of life, without questioning how absurd capitalism is? Because it's normalized and even celebrated that if I work, like even 40 is considered low for most people these days. And so the idea that somehow, look, I put in 80 hours this week, it's like a prestige thing, but then it's naturalized. Capitalism is so naturalized that if you're upset about it, you think, well, you don't question capitalism.
Right. I mean, I think there's there's sort of two angles that it goes. I mean, one is you have the group of people for whom, this is a badge of honor. Of course, Tyler, you know this in Northwest Minnesota. The best thing you could say about somebody is that they're a really hard worker. So there's that group of folks. And then you've got the group of folks that are on the survival end of things that are like, well, what I know about capitalism is if I don't work 3 shitty jobs and, 40, 50, 60 hours a week, I'm just going to starve to death. And so there really is not an obvious way out.
Mm-hmm. Last few comments here. Series voting for making partying the next topic. Okay. I mean, I'm down. Down like a clown. Cheryl writes, through Walter Wink, I learned turning your cheek is subversive, especially if you get to pick which cheek. Making a butt reference there. Ellen writes, they didn't want to party with Stalin either. I'm just in a goofy mood. But but they had to because he was a yikes machine. I want to see a cage match between Nestor Makhno and Joseph Stalin in a cage with just a machete in the middle of the room. I think Nestor would take him. Shell writes, the powers that be. Mm-hmm. Walter Wink's stuff on the powers is great. And that's we're talking about that in a couple of weeks in the class I'm teaching, Principalities and Powers. So Ellen writes, if you can make communication a weekly theme, you should have propaganda on as a guest. That'd be cool.
I guess that was a joke.
I don't know. Propaganda is a spoken word and hip hop artist who actually I know, so I could probably have him on as guest, but I don't know
okay. So,
the theme of communication. He was actually on an episode of Behind the Bastards, and I was like, "Whoa! I didn't realize that propaganda was really a big deal."
Okay,
but he is.
All right. So there's something I just learned. I did not know that was a person.
Yep. Well, with that,
all right,
we're past 40 minutes.
We're way past time.
Okay.
All right, great hanging out with y'all. I think we've won the game show of friendship and liberation.
Power of friendship.
Yeah. All right.
See you next week, everybody.
Bye.